Hey everybody, welcome back to another Crash Course video where I just very briefly show you how I roughly build my decks without going in too many details. Today we're gonna take a look at Red Dragons, which is probably the worst deck in the game when it comes to coalitions at least. So into it, logistics. This is one of the few times where I might actually recommend a Jeep. For one, because everything else that is cheap is not that survivable. You can run the CCC or YW. They have two front, two sides, so they are somewhat survivable against artillery. The John Maho, but only has 4 front armor. But this is actually decent cheap. You only get 5, but base availability 4. But thanks to the availability bonus, you get 5. But it's much faster and it's amphibious, which is fun. You can also run, which is actually probably even better, Infantry CV as well as the Tank CV, the ZCZ, one of the cheapest 2 top, 2 rear, 3 side and 7 on front, or like decently armored tank CV in the game. Most tank CVs in that price range have only 1 top armor, which, trust me, is not quite as good. So yeah, thanks to the availability bonus, you get 4 of each, so this is actually fine when it comes to CVs. Supply trucks, you only have 15.1s. I run 2 supplies and no fob. You can also run 1 supply and the fob. And there's only really 1 unit that eats a lot of, or eats a decent amount of supply, but funnily enough, comparatively, it eats not nearly as much. So it is possible to run with or without. It's really up to you. We'll get to that in the support tab. Infantry tab. There's already the first problems. For my fast infantry, I like to run Yakyunde's 90 in the BTR 80A. The transport, the 80A is amazing. The Type 69-3 is not too bad either. The problem is just that this being essentially your best, rifle-based anti-tank infantry is pretty frustrating at times. Only 10 RPM and 50% accuracy and 700 meter range is not too amazing. I mean, 23 AP is not too bad. The weapon itself is not too bad, but if it's the best you have available, it's frustrating. The MG is just basic. You have a carbine, so they're not going to be too bad against infantry. The infantry itself is fine. The problem is just that that's the strongest you get. I wouldn't skip. You could run the Marines, which are very similar but 15 men, and you might, for example, in the case of Falski Mega 90, you prefer them over the FSK, even if FSK were at the same price. But in this case, you don't want the extra 5 men for extra survivability, but worse DPS and higher availability, because that thing becomes even less accurate. Even if you upvet, it is not worth it because they're also much worse against infantry. Especially the primary weapon gets a massive boost in terms of DPS, because unlike DMG, you not only get extra accuracy but also extra rate of fire. So I would definitely not recommend using Geogok Day. Next up, there's you have an amazing IV available in the form of the ZSD90, which is ridiculously strong for 15 points. The problem is you only get it with 15 points or 25-point infantry. Currently I'm running them with the Shanxi 90 to get it as cheap as possible. The Shanxi aren't too horrible, they're not amazing, but they're usable. You can also run it with the Lujan 90 if you wanted extra AT. It's for 25 points, the squad is again rather underwhelming. 21 AP, 20 RPM, in and of itself is not too bad, but for 20 points, when all you have is an assault rifle and an RPK clone, yeah, don't bother with base Lucian Dui, that's just horrible. But yeah, I'm running Shanxi 85 in the CDSD. You can also run Lucian Dui 90 in the ZSD or in the 5-pointer for that extra AT. That is up to you. And next, what I would definitely recommend is at least 1 card. You can run 2, but you probably only need 1 card of Shanxi base in this specific 5-pointer. That is actually an amazing spam infantry because the squad itself is fine. You have the RPG-7 as opposed to, let's say, the M72 low found on most blue for spam infantry, which in my eyes is a massive upgrade for no cost. The 5-pointer is also really good, 2 front, 2 side, 50 cal, 70 kmh and amphibious, so it can definitely keep up with your infantry and your tanks, which is very important. You could, in theory, run spam Bo Chung Su, which apparently are a tad better against infantry. However, first of all, the infantry itself isn't really supposed to be, isn't needed to fight against infantry. And then 5-pointer is so much worse. It's so much slower, worse autonomy, and it might not sound like much, but having 1 instead of 2 side armor can be really painful, especially if on top of that you are much slower. I would definitely not recommend running them. But you can run them in the Hwasong Chong. which is a great transport, and this alone makes Red Dragons probably the only deck where you can have a fairly normal opener and still win against the Healer Rush. Currently I'm not running them actually, but you certainly can. What I am running is at the Card of Tankasaso 85 in WC 551. Amazing IV for 15 points, essentially also underpriced like the ZSD, however, it's just not noticeable because of the infantry it comes with. They're good at flanks or in openers, not as amazing in like high intensity fights, but in other scenarios like low intensity they are pretty good. You can run base Lichan in the ZSL if you want some elite grinders, especially for towns. I would not run Lichan 90 because Lichan, they're of course worse against infantry, but they're cheaper and can at least deal with 5-pointers. If you want man pets for some reason, you have the QW1 available. You have these reservists, they're 15 men, but in a 10-point wheel transport. Some people like them, I'm not a fan. And yeah, last but not least, I'm actually running the Fagot. Don't underestimate cheap ATGM spam. Next up, support. Probably the strongest tab of this deck. Anti-air is amazing. I really like the HQ61A. Amazing anti-plane piece, affordable. Sure, you need a supply truck, but for which heavy AA piece do you not? HQ7, Crotal, obviously also amazing, non-radar. And then a PGC-80 to fill your gaps and have a net of AA that, you know, if your HQ7 runs out of ammo, the PGC-80 will easily, you know, 2 or 3 of those will easily scare off any helicopters. And if they are too aggressive, they will outright kill them as well. These little fuckers are just amazing. They're good for base defense. They're even good for ground fire support at close range and have very good armor for their price. A mortar, of course, they have some good 5HE mortars. The North Korean one has more ammo, so use that one. And then artillery, they have one amazing artillery piece, and that's the BM24. It has a really good blast radius for damage and suppression on the rockets, and they eat very little supply. I wouldn't necessarily recommend using them at max range, but you know, if the front line is far away, you just spawned one, you might as well just fire a salvo right next to your fob, and once it's reloaded, drive it near the front line, and once it's dead, probably reload it again. But yeah, and this is why, I mean, you don't necessarily need the fob, because they're actually very cheap to resupply. But if you want to really spam them, especially if you downvet them, then yes, I would run a fob. Just keep in mind they have 30 seconds aim time, and ideally you want to use them in a stack of 2, but close to minimum range, even a single one can do a lot of work. Tanks have some nice stuff. You know, T90S is a decent super heavy. It's essentially like the Leopard 2A5, but better. You know, there's nothing special. 23 AP, 22 armor, 9 RPM. It's decently fast, it has good autonomy, 10 side opposed to 9 for the Leopard, of course. A bit less accuracy and stabilizer, but it has 4 HE, it has 50 cal, it has auto-loaded. It's a good super heavy. 85-3 is a decent heavy. It survives a double tap by a peace run, which is nice. It packs a lot of punch, but lacks an RPM. I like it, but the main issue is just that anything below. John Maho 5, as well as the 85-2A, can be decent mediums, but they just get shit on by nearly every other medium in the game. Maybe not stuff like the Leopard 2A1 or the M1 IP, but you know, the Wilks, the 84As, K1s, all of those that you see all the time, they will win against you most of the time. I prefer the John Maho 5, you can also run the CTC, but yeah, I prefer the John Maho. The CTS 63-2 can be a nice little boat tank if you like those. Can do some nice little stuff, but for 45 points they're also not very survivable, so you have to be careful and really have to choose your engagements and not just let it sit at the front line. Other than that, you know, the CTC line in general, the rest of the CTC line is just underwhelming. This is essentially a Leopard 1A5 NO2, but for the same price, you lose 1 RPM. And the NO2 already is not amazing. T72M is garbage, and the rest, not really worth talking about. Recon tab, I like to run the MI1. It's very cheap, very good optics. It's of course small, but very good optics for cheap. Sneaky tank. It's a good recon tank. It's a bit overshadowed by the 84AN, the Vercanning, as well as the T55P on PSV, but other than that, it's still very solid. Li Ren in the WC551 is a great combo. Li Ren in the Xenon A if you want something to sneak around flying. It's good. Other than that, BRDM2 is always, you know, if you can fit it in, more useful than people give it credit for. PT76 is decent. BDR40A is also very good, actually. The cheaper CDQs can also be fine, but this is what I run. Of course, as always, you can also run sniper squads. Next up, vehicles have PDC 89. Some people like. I'm not a huge fan. The lack of stabilizer is the main problem you have with that is that you have to stand still before aiming, and that means you virtually never get a first shot off in a direct fight. Also has no optics, and with 5 front armor, IFVs and the like are gonna cause serious trouble to you. So do rocket pods and stuff. So you get one shot by nearly all ATGMs. If you have the space, you know, there are certain scenarios where they can be nice, but they're fairly niche. What I like to run here is the SU-100. Unfortunately, you only get it on rookie or trained, but it's probably the best direct fire support that you have available. For 15 points, 8 RPM with decent range and 30% accuracy is nice. 4 front armor is good. Optics is not a huge deal, it's fast enough. The main issue is just honestly, for one, the veterancy, unfortunately, but also just, you know, if you had an MG, especially a 50 cal, that thing would probably be really good. But on these cheap units, having an MG or not having an MG can make a massive difference. WC 550 in team games is probably pretty decent, but in general, of course, ATGM vehicles fallen a bit out of favor over the past years, and it's very squishy as well, so you have to be careful. And 8 rounds missiles is actually not that many. Helicopters, there's a few decent choices. MR25, you know, I like to run just to have a cheap MR25 with a Yak B, you know, for flanks, for stuff that might have snuck through to deal with that. The HOT is incredibly underutilized and underappreciated, underrated. 40 points for a HOT carrier that is also very hard to kill due to how small it is. It's very fast, it's nimble. Don't underestimate these little fuckers. T190, hard to fit in. I wouldn't use it in 1 versus 1s, personally, because for 90 points it's just a pure anti-helicopter or anti-air helicopter, and yeah, it just doesn't do more than that. So if you buy it in the opener and the enemy has no helicopters for you to shoot down, then it's sort of 90 points wasted. Against certain decks, of course, if you know beforehand what you fight against, this might be a good reason to fit that in. However, you really have no issue to deal with helicopters in this deck, so this is the only reason to use this is really in the opener, and this deck doesn't really benefit that much from helicopter drops anyway. So yeah, mostly a team game thing to help your teams. The HJ8 for 60 points, it has a good range, but I think it's just overshadowed by the HOT, because yeah, it's also only carries 4 missiles, and yeah, they're not amazing. They're okay, but I would always go for the HOT instead. Planes, so you have some nice stuff, but mostly low end. ASFs, nothing is really great. You can run the SK, which is what I do. You can run the J8C. You can run both if you can fit it in. MiG-23 ML can also work in a way, but you only get 4 on hardened, not on veteran or elite, so that's annoying. SC25K can be usable, but for 110 points, 2 front armor is under the kinetic gun or heat gun, can be nice. I like the Q5D for dealing with blobs and tanks and stuff. J7H spam is really strong. The 2 J7s is the strongest way to play Red Dragons is probably just to spam J7s. It's probably the strongest thing you can do. JH7 for a decent ATGM plane. It's actually pretty good for 120 points, 40% ECM, essentially a peace run with a bit less range. It's not too shabby, honestly. Although the range, the 3150 compared to 3325 for Mavericks and 3500 for KH-29Ts on the 27M in the Syria, can be quite noticeable in my eyes. But, you know, fairly survivable, just fairly low time over target. B5, of course, is fun and all if you want to meme around, but generally not worth it with only 1 per card. The Firebow is a seed plane. It's, for 150 points, fairly low survivability, but has the best seed missiles in the game for when it matters, which is literally only against the Challenger Marksman. Other than that, yeah, this can be a decent cluster plane, I guess, but for 90 points, fairly low survivability once more. In general, ECM is a big problem here, as well as in general anything high-tech. It's a decent rocket pod plane, the SU-7. And of course the North Korean MiG-29 is the ultimate helicopter hunter, but yeah, if it gets into range on elite against planes, then that plane is in serious trouble, but the problem is getting there in the first place. So yeah, it looks cool at least. Well, this is what you could build the deck like. Of course, it has issues nearly everywhere, but for some people, it's also just a charm. But yeah, let me know what you think. Let me know what you want to see next. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time. See ya.